as I said, I concentrate only on the diuretics as I have been told. So the outline of my talk would be about the sites of action of the diuretics, the indications. So the diuretics have got many indications, so I think it's important that we know about it.
Can the
One case study, the side effects that we see, various side effects, diuretic resistance, which we must all know about, and a take-home message. So I'm sure you all know this slide, but then I think it's still important to recapitulate that the proximal tubule reabsorbs 65%, and this is where your carbonic anhydrase inhibitors and the diuretics act. Then there are the loop diuretics, which are very important, and they act on the thick ascending limb, and that accounts for 25% of the sodium absorption. Then we have the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule, where the thiazide diuretics act, and then after that, the distal tubule, the connecting tubule, and the collecting duct, where the mineralocorticoid antagonists and the potassium-sparing diuretics act. So what are the various indications? It's nice to go through all of them, that the osmotic diuretics are not much used as such, but they are used in certain cases, like in acute or incipient renal failure, especially to heme pigments, in earthquakes, etc., to prevent AKI, to reduce intraocular or intracranial pressure. The carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are used in glaucoma and altitude sickness. They are used. Resistant edema, and I'll talk about it subsequently, and metabolic alkalosis. The loop diuretics are very popular, and they are used in the edematous conditions, as has been discussed earlier this morning, the heart failure, cirrhotic ascites, nephrotic syndrome, hypertension, they are used. Acute kidney injury, we try to convert an oliguric person to a non-oliguric condition. Hypercalcemia, hyponatremia along with hypertonic saline, and here I will discuss how actually the loop diuretics increase free water clearance, and that's why they're useful in treating hyponatremia. Hyperkalemia, especially if it is of type 4 renal tubular acidosis type, and hypermagnesemia. The distal convoluted tubule diuretics, the thiazides, they are very popular as antihypertensives. They were actually first line as per the American guidelines. Now they are a little down. In various edematous conditions, nephrolithiasis, because they are useful in hypercalciuria, they retain calcium. In nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, osteoporosis, hypoparathyroidism, and in diuretic resistance in combination with other diuretics. So, you see, they have so many indications. The collecting diuretics are the potassium-sparing diuretics. These are the mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. We have the spironolactone, eplerenone, and now we have another finerenone, which is still not fully licensed. And then we have the epithelial sodium channel inhibitors, the amyloid and triamterene. And these are very useful in cirrhotic ascites, diuretic resistance, primary hyperaldosteronism, secondary hyperaldosteronism as well, lithium-induced diabetes insipidus. And recently, there's a lot of data on their usefulness as a cardioprotective and a renoprotective, because they reduce fibrosis, they reduce proteinuria, and they also probably reduce CKD progression. So there's a lot of data now on using these MRAs even in CKD. So now coming to our index case, this is a 68-year-old female who is a resident of Uttar Pradesh, a homemaker, a long-standing diabetic, 20 years, hypertensive for the last 15 years, has ischemic heart disease for 6 years, and was brought by a son to a casualty with altered sensorium. She was apparently all right 5 days back, but since then had been complaining of reduced appetite and anorexia, had altered sensorium for 2 days with some slurring of speech. There was no history of vomiting, seizures, fever, cough, dyspnea, or chest pain. Her medication history included metformin 750 mg BD, glimepiride 1 mg twice daily. Insulin had been added 1 year back to improve her sugar control. Aspirin 75 mg once and atorvastatin 10 mg. Telmisartan 40 BD and chlorthalidone 12.5 mg once in the morning for the last 6 months. Recently, she had developed some edema, and that's why on her own, she had added an evening dose of chlorthalidone 12.5 mg about a month back. Her clinical examination findings in the casualty revealed a pulse of 82, a BP of 146 by 82, a pulse rate of respiratory rate of 18 per minute. General examination shows afebrile, there was some pallor, but there was no edema or icterus. Skin exam, there was no focal neurological deficit, and otherwise she was okay, respiration was okay, and her motor, there was no deficit. Her oxygen saturation was fine, and the glucose was somewhat on the higher side by the glucometer. A heuristic examination was done, it showed some glucose, but there were no proteins or no ketones. The ECG was normal sinus rhythm with some LVH and an old inferior wall infarct. ABG was reasonably okay, except there was a sodium which was low 120, and these ABG sodiums often are not very reliable. There was some renal impairment. Those lactates were okay. X-ray test was okay, and the CT had non-contrast was normal. Her hemoglobin was 9.8, a TLC of 8,700, normal platelets. Urocreatinine were marginally raised, and the sodium was confirmed that it was definitely low of 120. Blood sugar was on the higher side. The LFTs were okay. So based on this, a diagnosis of query thiazide-associated hyponatremia was made. And now I'll discuss why I put this query and how one resolves it. So thiazide-associated hyponatremia is typically seen in elderly. In one analysis, it was about 75 years of age. They're frequently female, almost 3/4 of them. Usually they have a normal body mass index, but a sizable number are also malnourished. Mean time to thiazide-associated hyponatremia is, since initiation of therapy, is about 19 days, but it is very variable and can stretch from months to even years. The common symptoms are falls, fatigue, weakness, confusion, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, seizures, and ultimately loss of consciousness. Now, what are the criteria for diagnosis of thiazide-associated hyponatremia? This is from a recent Journal Kidney Disease guidelines. They're euvolemic by clinical assessment. This improvement following cessation of thiazide treatment by 3 milliequivalents in 1 day and 5 in 2 days. There's no significant improvement before cessation of thiazide unless you have given specifically 3% saline, urea, or avaptan. And there's no recurrence after resolution in the absence of starting a thiazide again. It has been discussed extensively this morning about hyponatremia. I'll just briefly recapitulate that the serum sodium is proportional basically to the total body exchangeable sodium plus the total body exchangeable potassium divided by total body water. So the factors which cause hyponatremia would be a net gain of water, net gain of cations, or both. Now, what normally happens is when there is hyponatremia, especially if it is hypotonic hyponatremia, the appropriate physiological response would be ADH suppression, urine dilution, and excretion of excess water. And the problem here with thiazides is the thiazides impairs free water excretion. This is in sharp contrast to the loop diuretics, which actually increase free water excretion. So loop diuretics are useful in treating hyponatremia if you're using it along with 3% saline, but the thiazides impair free water excretion. And why do they do that? You see the osmolality of urine entering the distal columnar tubule is fixed. It is always around 100, 150 milliosmoles per liter, irrespective of the ultimate urine osmolality. Ultimate urine osmolality is very variable. It can be as low as 50, going up to even 1400. But the urine which enters the DCT is just 100. And the thiazides, what they do is they block the sodium chloride co-transporter. So they block the reabsorption of sodium in the distal columnar tubule. And thus they impair the urinary dilution. And the urinary osmolality cannot come down to 50 anymore. It remains high. In fact, because of subsequent mechanisms, most cases of these usually have osmolalities of 400 to 600. So as you can understand, the very close differential is SIDH. The lab values are almost very similar. So the diagnostic criteria which I mentioned earlier, about the history of thiazide and how you stop them and then it improves. So that is what helps in making this diagnosis. And that's why basically it's a retrospective diagnosis. You can't make a diagnosis on admission, you can only presume it. But one factor which probably helps in differentiating between the two is that the serum uric acid is low in SIDH and the fractional excretion of uric acid is higher in SIDH, is more than 12%. And it is usually lower in cases of thiazide-associated hyponatremia. So, this is one complication which one must remember because thiazides are very extensively used. We all know about the other complications, but then this is one important complication which I thought we must highlight. So, how do you treat it? You stop the drug. Obviously, once you made the drug, you have to have a high index of suspicion. Substitute the loop diuretic if it is still indicated. Restrict free water intake. Give hypotonic saline very carefully. And then give Vaptans very, very carefully, as Dr. Ajay Kher discussed this morning. That is very dangerous because it can actually cause overshoot of increase in sodium. So one has to use Vaptans very, very carefully. Now I'll briefly just outline the other side effects of diuretics. They can cause hypokalemia, both hazards and loop diuretics. Hyperkalemia is seen with the potassium-sparing diuretics, but as has been discussed, I'll again recapitulate that hyperkalemia due to potassium-sparing diuretics is due to several other factors, which one must keep in mind. And one is, of course, many of these patients are using ACE ARBs, the RAS inhibitors, is very commonly used. How much dietary potassium they're taking, one has to assess that. It's very popular now to take low sodium salts, and these salts contain 50%, half of it is potassium. And a recent NEGM study from China, it was a large population study. They said it is absolutely safe, it doesn't cause any hyperkalemia. But then, at least in our group of patients, diabetics, CKDs, this message should not go that they can use low sodium salts freely. The underlying renal function, how they have CKD, and many of them do have CKD, and if they have an intercurrent volume depleting illness. So all these factors will actually increase the chances of hyperkalemia in a patient who is receiving potassium-sparing diuretics, and one has to be very careful. Then the other side effects are the hypercalcemia because of thiazides, hypocalcemia because of loop diuretics, hypomagnesemia because of both loop and thiazide diuretics, and hyperuricemia because of thiazides. And I think we have one debate also coming up. So hyperuricemia, even gout may occur with thiazides. One last very important complication of thiazides, and actually we had a case as well, was short of time, I will not be discussing that. One must remember that they can cause allergic reactions because these are derived basically from the sulfur group, sulfanilamide, and they can cause acute interstitial nephritis going on even to AKI. So one must have a very high index of suspicion and do an early kidney biopsy, of course, stop the drug, and then give steroids if indicated. A short course is usually useful in reversing the condition. This allergy can go on to even other organs like dermatitis, necrotizing vasculitis, or pancreatitis. And then, of course, one must remember that there are many other side effects of diuretics, which I will not be discussing: metabolic disorders because of dyslipidemia, dyslipidemia, or toxicity, and impotence or gynecomastia. Now, I'll briefly talk about when the diuretics don't work. So, what do you do? There's a problem. So, as you can see in this slide, the diuretics need a threshold dose, and then there's a steep rise. As you increase the dose, they act better, and then they reach a plateau or a maximal dose. So one has to be in this part of the curve and give the appropriate dose so that you have the best effect. And then what happens when they work initially and then they don't act? So that is called the breaking phenomenon, and one has to be very aware of that as well. So this is the condition of diuretics no longer produce a negative sodium balance. Why? Because it's a compensatory distal reabsorption. There's a distal to the diuretic action, there is salt retention. So this has also been discussed that it's very important to dietary salt. It's very important, and many of Indians take high salt. You can use multiple daily dosing of the diuretic. You can add another diuretic, treat diuretic-induced metabolic alkalosis, or even give it IV. So this is how you treat breaking phenomenon. And then use combination of, this has been discussed, but I think this needs to be capsulated. So you can use the loop diuretics along with the thiazide diuretic. You can use the loop diuretic plus a thiazide-like diuretic, which is metalazones. You can use loop diuretics with carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, that has been done. Loop diuretics plus mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, which are also very useful, and of course keeping a watch on the electrolytes. Loop diuretics for Vaptans. Aquatics have been used in heart failure. One has to be very careful there as well. And then, of course, if the patient is in hospital, one should use a loop diuretic infusions. So what happens in CKD? For my last couple of slides, that as you see, as the GFR reduces, whatever diuretic you give, the sodium excretion rate falls. The fractional excretion of sodium, that means the fractional excretion per nephron, is still okay. In the function nephrons, they're still excreting the 20%, but the overall sodium excretion rate goes down. So in CKD, this was also discussed by Tushar. And so then what do you do? So thiazides would act up to a creatinine of 2, so roughly early stages of CKD, 3 maybe, or even less than that. You can probably add a thiazide-like diuretic, indapamide and metolazone, which are useful in the later stages of CKD. So initially thiazides, then thiazides going on to loop diuretics, and then the first choice would be the loop diuretics and the combinations which I mentioned, which you can continue to use in stage 5 as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, my take-home message that there are several classes of diuretics. There are a wide range of indications, so one must know in depth about them. There are a variety of electrolyte disorders which are not uncommon in patients on diuretics. We have discussed hyponatremia in elderly females. Hyperkalemia is a problem with potassium-sparing diuretics, but if you use them carefully, know all the other basic things which aggravate hyperkalemia, you can use them very successfully and they have no protective effects, as the recent trials have shown. So I think in the near future, we'll be seeing much more use of potassium-sparing diuretics along with the loop diuretics. Also, because we now will be now be having the other oral potassium drugs, Patiromer, which will soon be available. So then we'll be able to use them more freely. So patients on diuretics need regular monitoring. We often forget that, because we start them on some diuretic, so, thiazide or a group, and then they're not monitored. So they need regular monitoring so that they do not develop the electrolyte disturbances. Very rarely they may develop interstitial nephritis, which may even go on to AKI, and one needs to suspect it, do a kidney biopsy, and treat it appropriately. And of course, one should use appropriate combinations, which will be helpful in treating various conditions. Thank you very much for your kind attention.